You're probably already familiar with the Tiger tank's fearsome reputation during World War II, how its 88mm gun could destroy Allied tanks from distances that seemed impossible, how its thick armor shrugged off shells that should have penetrated, and how Allied tankers whispered its name with a mixture of fear and respect. But here's what most people don't know. The moment Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, these legendary machines faced a fate arguably more final than anything they'd encountered on the battlefield. So what actually happened to the Tiger tanks after the war ended? The answer is both simple and surprising. Of the roughly 1,800 Tigers produced during the war, including both the WWII and the heavier Tiger II King Tiger, more than 99% were systematically destroyed between 1945 and 1948. The Allies captured them, studied them with scientific precision, fired every weapon they had at their armor, and then, in a deliberate campaign of elimination, either cut them apart for scrap metal or destroyed them with explosives. Today, fewer than 15 complete Tigers exist anywhere in the world, and only one can still move under its own power. This is the story of what happened after the shooting stopped, when the most feared tanks of World War II became intelligence prizes, then targets, and finally, almost by accident, museum pieces. Picture Europe in early May 1945. For nearly 6 years, the continent had echoed with the sounds of war, artillery barrages that never seemed to stop, aircraft engines droning overhead, the grinding metallic screech of tank treads on cobblestone streets. Then, on May 8th, Germany's unconditional surrender brought an eerie quiet that must have felt almost unnatural to anyone who'd lived through those years of constant noise. Across this suddenly silent landscape, Tiger tanks sat abandoned in positions they would never leave. Some rested beside muddy roads in northern France, their massive hulls camouflaged with tree branches that were already beginning to wither. Others stood in German forests, hidden under makeshift shelters their crews had built months or years earlier. Still others remained on the edges of battlefields where they'd fought their final engagements, their thick armor plates scarred with the impacts of anti-tank rounds. The numbers tell part of the story. Germany had produced approximately 1,800 Tigers during the war, 1,347 of the original Tiger WWII model, and around 490 of the larger Tiger II. The vast majority had already been destroyed in combat, knocked out by Allied guns, bombed from the air, or abandoned by their crews when mechanical breakdowns made them impossible to repair. But several hundred remained scattered across occupied Europe, and their conditions varied dramatically. At testing grounds like Kummersdorf and Hillersleben in Germany, Allied investigators found Tigers in various states of completion. Some sat alongside technical documents, spare parts inventories, and training manuals that German engineers had left behind when they fled or surrendered. In Bavaria, American forces discovered Tigers at the Henschel factory facilities where they'd been manufactured. British units in northern Germany and Austria encountered heavy tank battalions that had surrendered with their vehicles still operational, though completely immobilized by fuel shortages. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies rolling through Silesia, East Prussia, and Czechoslovakia overran Tiger positions and marked every example they found for immediate seizure. The condition of these surviving Tigers surprised many Allied officers who'd only encountered them as battlefield opponents. Some appeared nearly pristine, preserved by units that had surrendered intact rather than fighting to destruction. Others showed deliberate sabotage, turrets blown completely off by demolition charges, engines disabled with grenades, transmissions destroyed by their own crews to deny these powerful machines to the enemy. Many bore obvious combat damage, penetrated armor plates, damaged tracks, burn marks from engine fires, and the distinctive dents left by anti-tank weapons that had finally managed to stop them. It's likely that American tankers who'd fought through France and into Germany felt complicated emotions when they encountered these abandoned tigers. Relief, certainly, that they'd never have to face this particular machine in combat. Curiosity about the tank that had haunted their nightmares during the months of fighting. Perhaps even a measure of satisfaction that the beast was finally, definitively defeated. But for Allied intelligence officers and tank development specialists, these tigers represented something else entirely. A rare opportunity to answer questions that had cost thousands of lives on the battlefield. In the chaotic weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied forces launched what could only be described as an organized treasure hunt. Intelligence teams from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union spread across occupied Germany with clear orders: locate every intact Tiger tank, secure it, and prepare it for shipment to testing facilities. This task presented immediate practical challenges. Unlike captured aircraft that could be flown to new airfields with relative ease, Tigers were fundamentally different beasts. These weren't machines you could simply tow away with a truck. The King Tiger alone was heavier than any tank the Allies had fielded during the entire war. Moving these mechanical monsters required specialized rail transport, heavy recovery vehicles, and crews experienced enough to operate German equipment without damaging it in the process. One can imagine an American ordnance officer standing before a pristine Tiger outside Munich in June 1945, thinking about the irony of his situation. For 3 years, American forces had tried everything possible to destroy these tanks. Now his job was to figure out how to move one halfway across the world without breaking it. The Allied Control Commission established strict protocols for handling German armor. Every captured tank had to be immediately immobilized, weapons disabled, fuel drained, ammunition removed. Guards were posted to prevent sabotage or theft. Then came the debates within each Allied command about which Tigers were worth preserving for detailed study and which should be destroyed immediately. The Americans had clear priorities. The United States Army had first encountered Tigers in North Africa in 1943, then again in Italy, and finally in devastating numbers during the battles across France and into Germany. American tank crews, most riding in M4 Sherman tanks, had learned through bitter experience to fear the Tiger's 88mm gun, which could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't even scratch the Tiger's armor. Every engagement with the Tiger had meant American casualties, often severe ones. The Ordnance Department wanted answers to specific questions. Teams of engineers and intelligence officers fanned out across the American occupation zone, identifying intact Tigers and marking them for recovery. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, America's premier armor testing facility, prepared to receive whatever specimens could be shipped across the Atlantic. One Tiger had actually arrived much earlier, captured in Tunisia in 1943, and had been under systematic study since its arrival in the United States. By late 1945, additional examples began arriving from Europe. The British had their own painful history with Tigers. From the first shocking encounter in Tunisia through the grinding battles in Normandy, British tank crews in Cromwell's and Churchill's had faced an opponent that could destroy them from distances where they couldn't effectively return fire. It seems likely that British tankers who'd survived the Normandy campaign remembered watching helplessly as Tigers picked off their squadron's tanks one by one, each shot precise and devastating. At the School of Tank Technology in Chertsey and at the Lulworth testing grounds, British engineers prepared facilities to receive captured Tigers. They wanted comprehensive analysis, not just armor penetration data, but complete understanding of how these machines worked. Tiger 131, captured in Tunisia and shipped to Britain, became the centerpiece of this evaluation program. The Soviet Union pursued Tigers with perhaps the greatest intensity, which makes sense given their experience. The Red Army had faced more Tigers than any other Allied force. At Kursk in July 1943, newly deployed Tiger battalions had torn through Soviet tank formations with horrifying efficiency. From Kursk all the way to Berlin, Soviet armies had fought desperate battles against German heavy tank units, learning to fear and respect these machines. Soviet trophy brigades moved systematically across occupied Germany and Eastern Europe with a clear mission: seize every intact or repairable Tiger and ship it to Kubinka, the massive testing facility outside Moscow. For Soviet engineers who'd lost comrades and family members to German armor, each captured Tiger represented both a trophy of victory and an opportunity to understand exactly how these machines worked, and more importantly, how to destroy them efficiently. Competition emerged among the Allies for the rarest specimens, reflecting tensions that would soon define the Cold War. Everyone wanted a late-production Tiger II, which represented the pinnacle of German heavy tank design. At Henschel factories, Allied teams found partially completed hulls and turrets. At testing grounds, they discovered prototype variants that had never reached production, offering insights into developmental paths the war's end had cut short. German tank crews and engineers found themselves in unusual circumstances during this period. Some were detained for interrogation, their technical knowledge considered too valuable to simply let them return home. Others, perhaps recognizing that cooperation might improve their treatment, volunteered information about maintenance procedures, common failure points, and combat tactics. Without their assistance, Allied teams would have struggled to even start many of the captured Tigers, much less operate them safely for testing purposes. By late 1945, dozens of Tigers had been secured and were en route to testing facilities across the Allied world. The machines that had dominated battlefields from North Africa to the outskirts of Moscow were about to reveal their secrets through cold, systematic scientific analysis rather than combat. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, American engineers approached their captured Tigers with a single burning question that had been asked countless times in foxholes across Europe. Can our guns actually kill this thing? It was a straightforward question born from brutal battlefield experience. The standard American tank in 1944 and 1945 was the M4 Sherman, armed with a 75mm gun that performed excellently against German medium tanks, but proved woefully inadequate against heavy armor. Tankers who'd survived encounters with Tigers told remarkably consistent stories. They'd fired round after round at the massive German tanks, watching their shells bounce harmlessly off the thick frontal armor, while a single return shot from the Tiger's 88mm gun would punch through a Sherman's armor plate and turn the interior into an inferno. The testing protocol at Aberdeen was methodical and thorough. Engineers positioned captured Tiger hulls at measured distances and specific angles, then fired different American anti-tank weapons at them while carefully documenting the results of each shot. They tested the 75mm gun that equipped most Shermans, the improved 76mm gun that had been introduced late in the war, and the 90mm gun mounted on the new M26 Pershing heavy tank that had only reached Europe in small numbers near war's end. The results from the 75mm tests likely gave the observers a grim sense of vindication mixed with regret. Even at close range, under 500 yards, the 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. Shells simply bounced off the thick plate or shattered on impact. Even when rounds occasionally did penetrate, it usually required a perfect hit at a weak point, at ranges where the Tiger's own gun could destroy a Sherman with casual ease. One might imagine the test observers watching these demonstrations with complicated feelings. The data confirmed what Sherman crews had learned through hard experience in France. Engaging a Tiger frontally was essentially suicide. But American soldiers had been doing exactly that for 2 years because they'd had no alternative. The unspoken question hung in the air: how many young men had died in Shermans, firing uselessly at Tigers that shrugged off their shots? The 76mm gun performed better, but not dramatically so. It could penetrate a Tiger's side armor reliably and had a reasonable chance against frontal armor under ideal conditions, close range, perfect angle, the best available ammunition. But ideal conditions rarely existed in actual combat. Most tank engagements happened at medium ranges with both vehicles maneuvering, and under those more realistic conditions, the 76mm still struggled against Tiger armor. It's worth noting that American tankers had developed tactical solutions to compensate for their guns' inadequacy. They'd learned to use numerical superiority. Send 5 Shermans against 1 Tiger, flank it from multiple directions, and accept that you'd likely lose 2 or 3 tanks while trying to get side shots. They'd learned to use terrain intelligently, to set up ambushes at close range, where even the 75mm gun might penetrate thinner side or rear armor. They'd learned to coordinate with artillery, air support, and tank destroyers equipped with more powerful guns. These tactics had worked. The Allies had won the war, after all. But they'd come at a cost measured in American lives, and those costs were now quantified in Aberdeen's test results. The 90mm gun mounted on the M26 Pershing finally provided what American tankers had needed from the start, a weapon that could confidently engage a Tiger frontally at typical combat ranges. Test after test proved it. The 90mm had sufficient velocity and shell weight to punch through a Tiger's frontal armor with reasonable consistency. At last, American forces had achieved parity with German heavy armor in terms of gun power. But timing revealed a bitter irony. The Pershing had only arrived in Europe in early 1945, appearing in small numbers near the very end of the war. By the time American tankers had a weapon truly capable of killing Tigers on equal terms, Tigers were already becoming extinct, destroyed in combat faster than Germany could replace them, or abandoned due to fuel shortages as the Reich collapsed. The war had been won primarily with Shermans, by crews in outmatched tanks who'd succeeded through courage, tactical skill, and numerical superiority rather than technical parity. As the Aberdeen testing program wound down in 1946, the accumulated data answered the original question definitively. The Tiger's armor superiority had been real and significant, not merely perceived. The high Allied tank losses in Normandy, during the Battle of the Bulge, and throughout the final push into Germany, had clear technical explanations. American tank design philosophy had prioritized reliability, ease of mass production, and mechanical simplicity over maximum armor protection and gun power. That choice had ultimately won the war through sheer numbers, but the human cost had been substantial. The lessons learned influenced American tank development for decades afterward. The US Army became determined never again to field a main battle tank whose gun couldn't defeat the heaviest likely enemy armor. But by late 1946, the Tigers at Aberdeen had served their scientific purpose. Their intelligence value had been exhausted. What happened to them next would be decided by policies being formulated far from Maryland. While American engineers at Aberdeen focused primarily on the question of firepower and armor penetration, their British counterparts took a broader approach. Yes, they wanted penetration data. British tank crews had suffered against the Tiger's 88mm gun just as severely as American ones. But British testing programs also sought to understand the complete machine, its engine, transmission, suspension, optical systems, and overall engineering philosophy. At the School of Tank Technology in Chertsey and at Lulworth Testing Grounds, British engineers essentially performed detailed autopsies on captured Tigers. They removed and disassembled engines, transmissions, and gun mechanisms. They measured and weighed every significant component. They created thousands of detailed technical photographs and drawings. This represented engineering forensics on an impressive scale. Tiger 131, the example captured in Tunisia in 1943, became the centerpiece of this investigation. Unlike Tigers that had been completely destroyed or heavily damaged in combat, this particular vehicle had been captured relatively intact after taking hits that disabled it without causing catastrophic internal damage. British engineers had spent months coaxing it back to running condition, learning its quirks and peculiarities throughout that process. Test drivers who climbed into Tiger 131 for the first time probably expected to wrestle with a sluggish, unresponsive vehicle. After all, this was a 57-ton tank. Surely it would handle like trying to steer a building. But the Tiger surprised them. Its steering system, far more sophisticated than anything in contemporary British tanks, allowed relatively tight turns for such a massive vehicle. The interleaved road wheel suspension provided a remarkably smooth ride. One test driver might well have reported, "It's actually quite pleasant to drive, relatively speaking." The Germans clearly invested serious engineering effort in the suspension design. Gunners who test-fired the 88mm gun came away genuinely impressed. The optical quality of German gun sights exceeded anything used in British tanks. The gun itself demonstrated extraordinary accuracy, capable of hitting targets at ranges that seemed almost impossible with contemporary Allied optics. It seems likely that British gunnery officers, peering through the Tiger's commander's periscope for the first time, finally understood viscerally why Tigers had been killing Allied tanks from such intimidating distances. However, the British mechanical analysis revealed what might be called the Tiger's fundamental weakness, or rather, its collection of weaknesses that stemmed from the same source. The Maybach HL230 engine was undeniably powerful, producing 700 horsepower, but it consumed fuel at an appalling rate. British calculations showed that a Tiger burned approximately 2 gallons of fuel per mile on roads, and considerably more cross-country, with consumption increasing dramatically during movement. For comparison, a Sherman could travel nearly twice as far on the same fuel. The interleaved road wheel system, which provided that smooth ride quality, turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to maintain under field conditions. The wheels overlapped in a complex pattern that distributed the Tiger's weight beautifully, but also trapped mud, stones, and debris between them. In winter conditions, particularly on the Eastern Front, this trapped material would freeze solid, sometimes immobilizing the entire tank until crews could thaw it out. A British mechanic examining this system might reasonably have thought, "Brilliant engineering, absolutely brilliant, and completely impractical for actual field operations." The transmission represented perhaps the clearest example of German engineering philosophy as the British understood it: sophisticated, powerful, and fragile. It allowed the Tiger to turn smoothly and handle well despite its enormous weight. But it was also complex, difficult to repair outside of factory conditions, and prone to breakdowns. British reports documented that Tiger transmissions frequently failed during extended road marches, which explained why German doctrine emphasized transporting Tigers by rail whenever distances exceeded a few dozen miles. A British engineer compiling these findings might have concluded something like, "The Tiger represents a masterpiece of engineering achievement, which is precisely why it's such a nightmare to maintain." The Germans appear to have over-engineered the design. They created the most capable heavy tank they could possibly build, and in doing so, they made it unreliable, maintenance-intensive, and logistically unsustainable in extended operations. This analysis extended systematically across every aspect of the Tiger. The thick armor provided excellent crew protection, but made the tank so heavy that many bridges couldn't support its weight, and soft ground became impassable. The powerful 88mm gun was devastatingly effective, but used ammunition that was large, heavy, and difficult to store in adequate quantities. The sophisticated fire control system enabled accurate long-range shooting, but required skilled operators and proved difficult to repair when damaged. British reports compared Tigers directly to Shermans on operational metrics, and the contrast was striking. A Sherman required perhaps 1/3 the maintenance hours per operational hour that a Tiger demanded. Sherman spare parts were standardized and existed in vast quantities. Tiger parts were specialized and increasingly scarce. A Sherman crew with basic training could perform most field repairs. A Tiger needed specially trained mechanics with access to proper tools and facilities. Strategically, you could field 3 or 4 Shermans for the resources needed to maintain one Tiger in combat operations. These findings would significantly influence the development of the Centurion tank, Britain's first true main battle tank of the post-war era. The Centurion design attempted to balance the Tiger's impressive firepower and armor protection with dramatically improved reliability and ease of maintenance, essentially learning from both the Tiger's strengths and its operational weaknesses. By 1947, British engineers had extracted essentially all useful information from their captured Tigers. Tiger 131 would eventually be preserved for historical purposes, though the full restoration that got it running again wouldn't be completed until the 1990s, a decades-long project requiring fabrication of parts that no longer existed anywhere else in the world. But most other British-captured Tigers faced the same fate awaiting Tigers across occupied Europe: systematic destruction. If the American and British approaches to studying Tigers could be described as methodical and scientific, the Soviet approach might best be characterized as thorough and uncompromising. This intensity made sense given the Soviet Union's experience. No other Allied nation had faced Tigers in such numbers or suffered so severely from their capabilities. At Kursk in July 1943, newly deployed Tiger battalions had torn through Soviet tank formations with devastating efficiency. Some Tigers reportedly destroyed numerous Soviet tanks during that massive battle before being stopped, though exact numbers remain disputed in historical records. Soviet tankers learned to fear the Tiger, and that fear was well-founded. The T-34, which had shocked the Wehrmacht when it first appeared in 1941, found itself outmatched by the Tiger's combination of armor, firepower, and optical systems. From Kursk through to Berlin, Soviet armies faced Tigers in desperate, grinding battles. Each captured Tiger represented not just a military trophy, but something more personal. An opportunity to understand the machine that had killed so many Soviet soldiers and to develop better methods of destroying similar vehicles if they were ever encountered again. Soviet trophy brigades moved across occupied Germany and Eastern Europe with systematic efficiency. Every intact or potentially repairable Tiger was marked for transport to Kubinka, the massive testing facility outside Moscow that would eventually house the world's largest collection of captured German armor. One might imagine a Soviet engineer arriving at Kubinka in late 1945, walking through yards filled with Tigers, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. These were the same machines that had inflicted terrible losses on Soviet forces during the desperate battles of 1943 and 1944. They'd seemed almost invincible during those dark months, but now they sat silent and defeated, waiting to surrender their secrets. The Soviet testing methodology was straightforward and uncompromising. They wanted to know precisely how to destroy Tigers, so they tested every available Soviet anti-tank weapon against Tiger armor at various ranges and angles, documenting everything in exhaustive detail. They fired 85mm guns from T-34/85 tanks and IS-1 heavy tanks. They tested 100mm guns from prototype vehicles. They used the massive 122mm gun from IS-2 heavy tanks. Nothing was left untested. The results confirmed scientifically what Soviet tankers had learned through bitter experience. The 85mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's side or rear armor with reasonable reliability, but frontal shots remained difficult, requiring close range or fortunate hits on weak points. The 100mm gun performed better against frontal armor, but still struggled at typical combat ranges. Only the 122mm gun on the IS-2 could confidently destroy a Tiger from the front at reasonable engagement distances. The Soviets didn't limit their testing to firing Soviet weapons at Tigers. They also test-fired captured German 88mm guns against Soviet armor, and these results proved sobering. The Tiger's gun could penetrate any Soviet tank, including the heavily armored IS-2, from the front at combat ranges. This scientific confirmation validated the tactical doctrine Soviet forces had developed. Avoid frontal engagements with Tigers whenever possible, use numerical superiority to enable flanking maneuvers, coordinate attacks from multiple directions, and when forced into frontal confrontation, close the distance rapidly to minimize the Tiger's range advantage. The Soviets made some unusual discoveries as well. In Prague, they found Tigers that had been undergoing repair or modification when the war ended, revealing field modifications that German crews had developed to address reliability problems. In Silesia, they captured entire training facilities intact, complete with Tigers used for crew instruction and technical manuals in German that Soviet translators worked through methodically. Some Tigers were briefly restored to running condition for propaganda purposes. Soviet newsreels from 1945 and 1946 occasionally show Tigers being driven in victory parades with Soviet tankers at the controls. The message was unmistakable. German superweapons had been conquered by Soviet industrial and military might. But these propaganda uses were exceptions. Most captured Tigers were destined for use as target practice rather than parade vehicles. The influence of these studies on Soviet tank development appears subtle, but real in the historical record. While the Tiger didn't directly inspire specific Soviet designs, the IS-3's distinctive pike nose glasses, for example, came from Soviet experimentation with sloped armor. The extensive testing at Kubinka reinforced certain design priorities. Soviet post-war heavy tanks would emphasize larger guns, thicker armor, and improved optical systems. But they would also maintain the Soviet emphasis on mechanical simplicity, ease of mass production, and operational reliability that the Tiger so conspicuously lacked. Stalin himself reportedly took personal interest in German heavy tank development. He pushed Soviet designers to match or exceed German capabilities and demanded that the Soviet Union field the most powerful tanks in the world. The Tigers at Kubinka fed this drive, providing both technical data and propaganda value, tangible proof that Soviet engineers could not only match German technology, but improve upon it. By late 1946, Soviet engineers had extracted essentially all useful information from their Tiger collection. Some examples would be preserved for museums, becoming centerpieces of exhibitions demonstrating Soviet triumph over fascism. But most faced the same systematic elimination awaiting Tigers throughout Europe, a fate that would be sealed by an Allied directive issued just months after Germany's surrender. In late 1945, the Allied Control Council, the body governing occupied Germany, issued a directive that would seal the fate of nearly every Tiger that had survived the war. The order was simple, absolute, and non-negotiable. Germany could not retain any armored fighting vehicles. Every tank, every self-propelled gun, every armored car had to be either completely destroyed or removed from German territory. The Tigers preserved for Allied testing represented only a tiny fraction of those that survived Germany's surrender. The rest, scattered across Europe in various conditions, were marked for elimination. This elimination would be thorough, systematic, and swift. Destruction methods varied depending on location and each tank's condition. In Germany itself, disposal sites were established at former military bases and training grounds. Tigers deemed to have no further testing value were brought to these sites for systematic destruction. Many Tigers became training targets for Allied gunnery units. American, British, and Soviet tank crews used them for practice in tank destruction techniques. It's likely that gunnery officers told their recruits something like, "That's a Tiger." 2 years ago, seeing one meant American soldiers were about to die. Now you're going to learn exactly how to destroy it. And the crews would fire round after round at the immobile hulk until its armor was perforated and its interior completely destroyed. At Bergen-Hohne in northern Germany, British forces assembled a large collection of German armor for destruction. Tigers sat alongside Panthers, Ferdinands, and various self-propelled guns, the remnants of the Panzer force that had once terrorized Europe. British engineers studied efficient methods for rendering the tanks permanently unusable. Sometimes they simply removed guns and disabled engines. Other times they packed turrets with explosives and blew them completely off, creating dramatic destruction that ensured the tank could never be reassembled or restored. But increasingly, the primary fate of Tigers was industrial scrapping. By 1946, this wasn't primarily about military necessity. Germany posed no military threat to anyone. This was about economics. Post-war Europe faced severe shortages of steel, copper, and other industrial metals. The thousands of tons locked up in abandoned German armor represented valuable resources for rebuilding, and for communities recovering from war, these scrap operations provided desperately needed employment. A French farmer in 1947, watching workers cut apart a tiger that had sat abandoned in his field since 1944, might well have thought, "I'm not concerned with history right now. I need to rebuild my barn, and they're paying good money for that scrap metal." Scrap dealers moved into tiger graveyards with cutting torches and heavy equipment. They sliced through armor plate that had resisted Allied anti-tank guns during the war, cut the thick steel into manageable pieces, and shipped it to steel mills, where it would be melted down and reformed into peaceful products, perhaps girders for buildings, railroad rails, or farm equipment. Destruction patterns varied somewhat by region. In Normandy, several tigers that had been knocked out during the Allied invasion remained where they'd fallen initially. Some were buried by local authorities clearing roads and agricultural fields, simply covering them with earth to get them out of the way. Others were dragged to collection points and systematically scrapped. The French army briefly considered retaining some German armor for their own use, but the logistical challenges proved insurmountable. Tigers required specialized fuel, specialized spare parts, and specially trained mechanics, none of which were readily available in post-war France. In Soviet occupation zones, the approach differed slightly from Western zones. While many Tigers were destroyed, the Soviets preserved significant numbers for museums and propaganda purposes. Museums in Moscow, Leningrad, Warsaw, and Prague received Tigers for public exhibition, where they served as powerful symbols of Soviet victory over German technology. Some were even restored to running condition for propaganda films and military parades, though these remained exceptions rather than standard practice. Whether scrapped, destroyed, or preserved, the underlying rationale remained similar across all Allied zones. Tigers represented German military power, and that power had to be permanently dismantled. Unlike captured aircraft, which could potentially be converted to civilian cargo use, tanks had no peaceful application. They were purpose-built weapons of war, and in the post-war world, there was no place for them outside of museums and testing facilities. Environmental concerns also played a role in the push to remove Tigers from the landscape. Abandoned tanks leaked fuel, oil, hydraulic fluid, and other chemicals that contaminated soil and water sources. Local authorities wanted them removed from farmland, forests, and waterways. Some Tigers had been driven into rivers or lakes during combat, desperate final acts by crews trying to prevent capture or simply trying to cross water obstacles. These underwater wrecks were often left in place, considered too difficult or expensive to recover. Many remain submerged today, occasionally discovered by divers or revealed during severe droughts when water levels drop dramatically. By 1948, the Great Elimination was essentially complete. The vast majority of Tigers had ceased to exist, Battlefield wrecks had been scrapped or buried. Depot stocks had been destroyed. Testing specimens had been fired upon until reduced to scrap. The small number preserved in museums and testing facilities represented almost all that remained of the roughly 1,800 Tigers produced during the war. The speed and thoroughness of this elimination reflected Allied determination to ensure Germany could never again threaten European peace, but it also reflected what might be called a failure of historical imagination. In their understandable rush to dismantle German military capability and recover valuable materials for reconstruction, the Allies destroyed most examples of what would become one of the most studied and discussed weapons in military history. By the time historians and museum curators realized what had been lost, it was far too late. So what happened to the Tiger tanks after World War II? The answer, stated clearly, is that the vast majority, more than 99%, were systematically destroyed between 1945 and 1948. Of roughly 1,800 produced, fewer than 15 complete examples survive today, with only one capable of movement. They were captured, studied scientifically, and then eliminated through a combination of Allied determination to dismantle German military power and post-war economic necessity that valued their scrap metal more than their historical significance. But the story contains lessons beyond mere statistics. It demonstrates how quickly even the most formidable machines can vanish when circumstances turn against them. Tigers survived years of combat, Allied air attacks, mechanical breakdowns, and desperate last stands. They survived everything the war could throw at them, but they couldn't survive peace, or more precisely, they couldn't survive the economic and political pressures of the immediate post-war period. There's genuine irony in this outcome. The Tigers that Allied tankers feared above all other weapons, the tanks that seemed almost invincible on the battlefield, fell to scrap merchants cutting torches and explosive demolitions in a systematic campaign lasting just 3 years. The legend grew even as the physical machines disappeared, and today the Tiger exists more prominently in historical memory and documentation than in physical form. The Allies' determination to eliminate German military capability is certainly understandable given historical context. In 1945, with the war barely ended and tens of millions dead, virtually no one was thinking about historical preservation. People were thinking about preventing Germany from ever threatening Europe again, about recovering valuable materials for reconstruction efforts, about moving past the war and building peaceful futures. The Tigers represented everything they wanted to move beyond. But there's also a cautionary lesson here about historical preservation, or rather, about the costs of failing to preserve. By the time military historians and museum curators fully realized what had been lost, it was far too late. Nearly all the Tigers were gone, destroyed or scrapped, their historical value recognized only after elimination was essentially complete. We study the handful that remain with intense attention precisely because we destroyed so many. We're trying to reconstruct comprehensive understanding from fragments. Modern historians examining Tigers must work from incomplete evidence. Technical reports from the 1940s testing programs provide valuable data, but there's no substitute for examining actual machines. When researchers discover a previously unknown modification or field repair on Tiger 131, it raises unanswerable questions. How common was this feature? Did all Tigers have it, or just this one? We'll never know with certainty because we destroyed all the examples that might have provided answers. The post-war elimination of Tigers reshaped their historical legacy in another significant way. Because so few survived, and because most survivors ended up in museums, the Tiger became more myth than machine for subsequent generations. People grew up seeing Tigers only in museums or historical photographs, never as ordinary battlefield equipment. This scarcity fed the Tiger's reputation, made it seem more rare and exceptional than it actually was during the war, when it represented just one component of German armored forces. Perhaps there's something fitting in the fact that machines built for destruction were themselves mostly destroyed. Tigers were purpose-built weapons of war, designed specifically to kill other tanks and the men inside them. When their war ended, they had no other purpose. Unlike bombers that could be converted to cargo planes, or trucks that could transition to civilian use, Tigers could only ever be weapons. The post-war world genuinely had no place for them except as museum exhibits or sources of scrap metal. What remains, those few museum pieces scattered across the world, serve important purposes as reminders. They remind us what industrial warfare looks like when nations commit total resources to conflict. They remind us of the human cost associated with weapons like these, the thousands of Allied tankers who faced Tigers in combat, many of whom never came home. Every surviving Tiger represents not just German engineering achievement, but also the courage of the men who had to face these machines with inadequate weapons. A visitor to Bovington, watching Tiger 131 move during one of its rare demonstrations, might experience complicated emotions. Or at the engineering, certainly, it remains an impressive machine by any standard. Respect for the history it represents, seeing a genuine artifact from the deadliest conflict in human history. But perhaps also a sobering reminder of what these machines were built for, and what they cost in human lives during their relatively brief service period. The Tigers are gone now, but their shadow persists, cast not by the machines themselves, but by the legend that outlived them, and by the hard lessons learned when the Allies realized, decades too late, that they'd destroyed most examples of what would become one of history's most studied and discussed weapons. In the end, what happened to the Tigers after World War II is simply this. They vanished almost completely, victims of systematic elimination that seemed necessary and practical at the time, but which left us with only fragments of a much larger story. What little remains must serve as windows into a past we can no longer fully reconstruct, because we destroyed the evidence decades before we realized we might want it preserved for future study. And perhaps that's the final lesson worth considering, that history is fragile in ways we don't always appreciate in the moment, that even massive 57-ton tanks made of thick armor plate can disappear almost entirely, and that what we choose to preserve or destroy shapes how future generations understand the past in ways we might not anticipate when making those choices. If you found this deep dive into the fate of Tiger tanks insightful, there's more history to explore on this channel. Consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to join us as we uncover the untold stories behind World War II's most iconic weapons and the soldiers who faced them. Your support helps us bring these forgotten chapters of history to light. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. We'll see you in the next video. We'll see you in the next video. We'll see you in the next video.